in one village we were in today, the soldiers were showing them some of the images from places like Bucha around Kyiv, and people told us they had no idea that Russian soldiers had ever got to that part of Ukraine, that they had no idea they'd ever got near Kyiv.
Fascinating report. I say fascinating. I haven't had a chance of looking at it yet, but I'm pretty sure that it's going to be very fascinating indeed. It's Catherine Philp is the author, the Times World Affairs editor, reporting from Kursk, which is that part of Russia, from the Donbass, I believe now, a correction there, who's been embedded, as it were, living, working, moving among Ukrainian forces. So seeing it all very, very close and very personal. And Catherine is with us now, live on the line, to share what she found there and some reflections on her own piece. Catherine, hello.
Hi, John.
It's lovely to have you here, Catherine. So, I mean, tell us more. I haven't had the advantage or the pleasure of reading your piece yet. So tell me, what are you telling us? You've been embedded, I know that much.
Understood. So I'm currently actually in the Donbass, which is where there's obviously some quite ferocious fighting going on between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. The piece is actually a dispatch from Ukrainian-controlled Russia. So that part of Kursk, which you correctly mentioned, that part of Kursk that Ukrainian forces penetrated 3 weeks ago and are holding a pocket of.
Right.
So we visited the town of Suja, which is under total Ukrainian control. It was taken with such speed that the local Russian authorities there just fled and left civilians to fend for themselves. It's a town of about 5,000 people, or it was before the Ukrainians arrived, and those that managed to get out had to go under their own steam. So
Yes.
when we arrived there, the remaining civilians, about 600 of them, were people that didn't have the opportunity to leave. So they were mostly elderly, disabled, some younger people who just simply didn't have that opportunity to get out.
Yes.
So they were mostly sheltering. Some of them had emerged, had hidden in their bunkers, in their basements, and come out only when they kind of realized that there weren't hostilities ongoing in the town, that the Ukrainian troops who were going around house to house saying, you can come out, we're not going to harm you. They had gathered in a school where they were sheltering, and they were being supplied with food and water and whatever else they needed.
Right. Right. So this then, Catherine, it's a valuable opportunity for us to hear and for anyone to read in your piece what it's like in that occupied part of Russia, the Kursk region, which is now held by Ukrainian forces, some hundreds of square miles now being held by Ukrainian forces, and to see how that is going from the point of view of those Russian civilians who are still in that now occupied territory, and the Ukrainian forces who are now occupying forces. Can I just start with them with the Ukrainian forces? What do you pick up from them, from what they are saying to you, from what they're doing about their mission in what is now occupied Kursk? What do you pick up and what do you learn from that?
Yeah. Well, before I'd gone in, I had spoken to soldiers who were part of that offensive, and they were mostly the forward forces. So I spoke to people who'd come out because they were wounded, were fighting. Most of the people in Suja who were in charge of the civilians, it's a peculiar role for them to play because they're effectively a sort of civilian administrative force there. And really what they've gone in there, obviously they're holding that ground. There are forward forces who are capable of seeing off any counterattack or primed, I should say, to see off any counterattack from the Russians. And indeed, we could hear quite intense artillery battles going on outside of Suja. But they were there primarily to tend to the civilians and to, kind of deliver this message that they were not going to act on Russian soil the way that Russians had acted on Ukrainian soil. So, they were kind of extending a hand of friendship to them and sort of trying to show the difference between the two sides and kind of, tell them a little bit more in some cases about what had actually been going on in Ukraine, which not all the people we met were fully aware of. I mean, these are people who either are not interested in the news, had never paid attention to what was going on, or who had only ever seen Russian state coverage of what was happening in Ukraine. So, for example, in one village we were in today, the soldiers were showing them some of the images from places like Bucha around Kyiv, And people told us they had no idea that Russian soldiers had ever got to that part of Ukraine, that they had no idea they'd ever got near Kyiv.
Yes, that is again so interesting, Catherine, because we of course have seen the accounts in some horrific detail through you and some of your colleagues of what Russian forces have been doing in those occupied areas of Ukraine, the widespread torture of captured civilians, the rape of women, the abduction of children on an industrial scale, the mass graves and so on. And the people you spoke to, the Russians, in what is now occupied territory, simply had no notion of all of that.
No concept whatsoever, even amongst those who possibly would have been inclined to believe it. I certainly met people who, appeared to have a wall of resistance up to imagining that their forces were capable of that. And so in one village outside Suja, one of the soldiers actually brought a laptop. So he brought supplies for the older people there. And then he brought a laptop with some footage of what had happened in Bucha and Irpin and some of the destruction. And he showed it to them, and a couple of them watched just very quietly. The mayor of the village wasn't having any of it. She said, "Oh, but this has happened in Belgorod, which is the neighboring oblast to the one that we were in, Kursk. This has happened in Belgorod. Look, they've suffered the same." She, even when she saw pictures of the destruction wrought by the Russian bombardment around Kyiv, she pointed to her own window and said, "Well, look, my window's broken." And then the next bit of footage to come out was of investigators unearthing a mass grave in Bucha. And so I said to her, "And are there mass graves in Belgorod?" And she looked for a second and said, "Mass graves? No, maybe not."
Yeah, my word. Joe Tanner is here with me, Catherine, as is Matthew Talbot. Both keen to talk to you, Joe.
It's extraordinary listening to what you're saying, because we get so used to the propaganda. It must be incredible to be on the other side and to see the reactions of people as you're sort of telling them actually what's been unfolding. It potentially actually quite emotional, I think, as well for you on the ground.
Catherine.
I mean, I had a brief amount of time in there, and it's sort of after you come out and kind of digest it. Certainly, Alexei, who was with me, my fixer, translating, he was shaking his head. I could tell he found it quite difficult to listen to. And then one of my other colleagues, Vika, listening to some of the recordings from there, I think, she said it made her angry to hear that. I mean, it's quite difficult to know, what to think or to say when people are in this bubble where the only coverage they would have would be Russian state television. Now, a lot of these people said to us they hadn't even watched that. In this village, she came back quite angrily and said, "Well, we haven't had proper electricity for a year, and the Ukrainians shelled our power plant." In another place, in Suja itself, one man did say that he just had no idea, because all that he knew about, all that he'd seen on Russian television, was what happened in the Donbass, which I'm in right now. And what's interesting about that is that that's the part of Ukraine that that is the primary objective for Russian forces to take. That's the place that is dominated by Russian speakers, and where they've been able to justify this Kremlin message that they're going in there to save Russian speakers, and it's a sort of kind of ethnic protection program. But actually, the soldier who was showing them this footage in this village, he pointed to these people who were speaking to the camera in Russian. These are Ukrainians in places like Bucha. And he said, "Look, half of these people are speaking Russian, but you have been told that your army went in there to protect Russian speakers. It's not true."
Matthew Talbot's here too, Catherine.
Catherine, fascinating to hear about what it's like on the ground. I was just wondering, it seems to be quite widely known that Vladimir Putin is struggling to get people to sort of sign up to this war effort, and the last sort of conscription seemed to cause some level of social unrest. They think he's going to need about 10,000 more soldiers to sort of push back at what's currently happening. Because their military is sort of quite an old-fashioned and slow to react military operation, Do the Ukrainian forces on the ground feel prepared for when the Russians are sort of up and ahead of steam over the coming weeks? And I suppose the other thing is, my great-grandma lived through the Second World War, and she would always say to me that war, never let anybody tell you that war is great or glamorous, it is hell. And I just wonder, for these forces on the ground on the Ukrainian side, do they feel positive? Do they feel like they're now winning this war as they sort of advance into that territory?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. I think that definitely when they first broke through, there was huge sort of morale boost in doing so. It was sort of taking the fight to the Russians and showing them, in a way, a taste of their own medicine. And this could happen too. That this could happen to them as well, that their defenses could be penetrated, that it's the first invasion of Russian territory since Second World War. And the fact that, Russia can't even beat Ukraine on its own soil, and yet Ukraine can still launch an invasion into Russia of this kind, has been a huge boost for them. I think we're getting to this stage now where obviously the fight is getting tougher. So in the last few days, I have two soldiers who've been wounded in like literally the last 3 days inside Kursk, and they spoke of it suddenly getting harder, that more Russian artillery was arriving from elsewhere, from other fronts, and that they were facing a level of resistance that they hadn't encountered. So the Russian machine, although slow, has started creaking into gear and coming back at them. So I think for those on the ground, yeah, reality obviously is getting tougher. Reality is sinking in. We heard of units in which they had taken quite a lot of losses. Some people, I think, have suggested too that Ukraine may have advanced further into Kursk than is probably advisable at this stage. That maybe it might be time for them to hold their positions rather than try to advance. And certainly when we were in Suja, there was a great deal of shelling to be heard from battles going on further out. And people told us that had intensified over the last week. So there is no question that the Russians are fighting back. To what, at what strength they can do so, I guess we will see over the coming weeks.